All right. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It happens to the best of us, but I'm sure Michelle just mentioned to you all that we've been getting so many questions about the vaccine and whether or not to mandate it and what to do through it. So we put together this quick presentation for you guys. Feel free to ask any questions. We're always happy to help in every way we can.
If you have, really quick, sorry to interrupt. If you have questions, just put them in the chat, and whoever's not talking will do the best they can to jump on and answer questions in the chat. And if there's something we think that might be relevant to everybody, we'll try and answer them live.
Yes, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A, because that's always an option too. All right, so just a disclaimer, because we are attorneys, that content on this webinar should not be considered legal advice and is for informational purposes only. Communications made through this webinar and or participating in this webinar do not create an attorney-client relationship, even though we specifically sent this to our clients and our best friends. So you probably already fit in that category, but we are not responsible for any content that you may access from third-party resources that may be accessed through or linked through this webinar. So today's topics, we have quite the gamut for you, a lot to cover. And this is a quick summary of it. I won't spend time on the agenda, but you get the hint. And then just a COVID vaccine overview. It's becoming available basically in the last month, really. And it's been a huge relief for everyone in our country. And it's really a sign that we're moving towards the end of the pandemic, finally, right? Next month, we'll hit 1 year since our first shutdown. And before we dig into the very specifics about mandating vaccines, Michelle and I are going to address a few key issues first. And we briefly wanted to review these issues before we get moving in on the nitty-gritty details, which will segue us into addressing the avenues for employers to get involved, which is, of course, why we're all here to begin with. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with our level of understanding of the vaccines we're discussing and where we are in the vaccine rollout process. Now, if you're in the medical field, we understand that this may be information you're already really familiar with, but it's important to touch on this just as a brief point. And every county is different with its rollout. So just keep that in mind. I mean, we're in LA County, but we have clients all over Southern California and even nationwide. So as many of you know, certainly there are 2 vaccines presently which have been given the emergency use authorization form from the FDA. Oh, we already have a long question. Michelle, let me continue on this slide and then maybe you can help answer that. So the 2, that are currently being used in the vaccination process, one is from Pfizer and the other is from Moderna. There are other vaccines like Johnson & Johnson, which is a single dose vaccine that's in the pipeline right now. And, we're very hopeful that it will receive the emergency use authorization form in the coming weeks or months, but presently those are the 2 being administered in the US, the Moderna and Pfizer. And it's important to understand the difference between the emergency use authorization and FDA approval in this context, because it's not full approval of these vaccinations by the FDA. They're still collecting data on these vaccines, and everyone who receives the vaccines is monitored, not just the people who participated in the clinical trials early on. So for those of you who are in the position to administer the vaccine or facilitate the administration to your employees, you need to make sure that you are familiar with the medical monitoring requirements, because that data is continuing to be collected. So far, data is very good and the vaccines appear to be highly effective, which is just good information, but of course we don't yet know the long-term effects of the vaccine. There have been some medical issues tied to vaccines, including the potential allergic reaction and certain contradictions, i.e. certain medical conditions or medications that preclude the person from being able to take one of the vaccines. We also know that certain people were excluded from clinical trials for the vaccine, including pregnant women. And those individuals were encouraged to consult with their own medical providers about the safety and transmission of the virus, which is an interesting distinction, you know. So for that reason, and as a practical matter, even if the entire workforce is vaccinated, employers should expect to leave their COVID-19 safety protocols, such as masking, social distancing, sanitation. You want to leave those in place for some time, especially if you have if you're interacting with the public or non-employees. And Michelle and I are really expecting some more information and guidance from the FDA as they update the emergency use authorization, and we will have some information on these issues as the vaccines make their way towards final approval. And I will say this, Michelle and I are committed not just to our clients and helping navigate, you know, complex or simple employment matters. We really try and stay in the know of what is going on in basically the world, our nation, our state, and our counties. And if you are starting to hear something or think it would be a good topic for a webinar, we are always open to doing webinars. In fact, my goal this year is to do 100 speaking engagements, and I want to make at least 12 of them, one per month, for just our clients. So if you have ideas on topics or anything specific that you want to hear about that you think would be relevant to, you know, other business owners that are just like yourself, who we represent, you know, always happy to talk about key issues that you guys are facing. And I just got a question in the chat about being able to provide a copy of the presentation for those who attended. Yes, absolutely. This is being recorded. I believe I hit, yes, it is being recorded. And I will send that out as soon as I get it updated to the cloud to everyone who came today, along with any other key information that I say throughout. Okay, Michelle, I see you just answered that the long question we already got in the chat. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so moving right along, vaccine access in California. This, of course, has been evolving and has changed fairly dramatically in recent weeks. Of course, the vaccines are a very limited resource, and I'm sure you know that the CDC has put out recommendations on the order in which people should be vaccinated. Each state has their own general or has generated their own health orders, and California, of course, followed in that same line. And although the actual vaccination protocol for California has not been modified, the Department of Health and Human Services announced a priority shift to expand to include all persons over the age of 65. So that group of individuals is now able to be vaccinated. And I know in LA, we are currently in phase 1B on this chart. We have not yet, it has opened up access to all persons over 65, but the last I looked, which is this morning, is that that's where it stops on the list. So to give some perspective on how large this group of people is, it's composed of a majority of the baby boomer generation. So large that the generation is literally named for how large the generation is. The upshot of this is that it's a prioritized group, and that they've had the highest mortality risk if they contract COVID-19. So unfortunately, this is also making life a bit more difficult for employers, because most workplaces don't include a large percentage of people over the age of 65, of course. So this is a hindrance to many of our clients moving past the pandemic in terms of their operations, because much of the US workforce outside of essential workers will not be vaccinated for quite some time. And we'll get into this. But in addition, the federal government initially allocated doses based on estimated state and local population, but the states have been expected to figure it out from there. So we anticipate a shift in that regard as the new administration adjusts the COVID-19 response, and have seen some changes recently, and we'll get into more of that and how it affects our employers. So I'm going to cover this, and then Michelle's going to take over. But there are several avenues for employer involvement in the vaccine system. Many of the local counties are overwhelmed with the demand for the vaccine and a lack of infrastructure to support the coordination of administering the vaccine. The Vaccine Administration Management System, or VAMS, is anticipated to be helpful in the future to assist with administration, record keeping, and infrastructure support for health systems, healthcare providers, employers seeking to coordinate vaccines for employees and individuals. So additionally, there are locations that are becoming more well-known that are now called pods, which are a point of dispensing or point of distribution locations. And these are partnerships with public health agencies to provide the vaccine either at a large open or a defined closed population. So depending on the location, there may be opportunities for employers to establish pods for employees and their families, their employees' families. And we're definitely expected to see more announcements about opportunities to come from the new administration, as we just received information that they have purchased more doses with the optimistic goal of vaccinating the entire population by the end of summer. So there's also the opportunity for healthcare providers to register as state immunization providers. And this brings us to the next key question of whether employers should be mandating or recommending COVID-19 vaccinations to their employees.
So this is the big question, right? So at this point, while supply is limited and the vaccine's only being offered to certain specific populations, it's really very difficult for anyone to mandate the vaccine in the workplace. But as time goes on, of course, that's going to change, and the vaccine is going to be more readily available to everyone. And this question is, I mentioned in the beginning, it's really going to be more pressing for you. So even then, it really needs to be an informed decision. And it's going to factor in logistical issues, public health policy, community considerations, as well as some legal and employee relations considerations that impact each worker and or the group of workers that you're considering mandating the vaccine, receive the vaccine. So, first, there's going to be logistical considerations. Is it even available to your workforce? Is there a way to distribute it? Is there a way to administer it? Of course, if the answer to any of these questions right now is no, which at this point, that's probably pretty likely, because unless you're in the healthcare field or if you're lucky enough to be able to vaccinate your entire group of employees, it's not reasonable to mandate a vaccine for your employees at this point. Second, public health policy it's continued to change. For example, the priority shift to include all persons 65 plus in most counties in California, not all of them, was recently just a huge shift, and it likely delayed vaccines for other groups of essential workers. So in addition, with the transition to the new federal administration, we expect that there might be more shifts as well. We just don't know yet what those are. And we've been joking a little bit that this is like the Wild West for us as employment attorneys, but it's somewhat true because we just don't know. So it's really something that you're going to need to keep your eye on. And then third, consider what's happening in your community before you make that decision. Are schools open for in-person learning? Do a lot of your employees use public transportation? Those are things that you should be considering when you decide how important it is to mandate or just recommend the vaccine. And then finally, there's the legal and employee relations issues, which are impacting each employee and group of employees. And this is really where we're going to focus the rest of this presentation. And as it turns out, it's something that we were a little bit surprised to find out. Some of this is actually the most important things that you should really be considering, because it's going to impact how likely your employees are to actually want to get the vaccine, which is a really interesting statistic. So we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. But we're going to at least begin first with the EEOCs guidance that was issued back in December of 2020 on the issue of vaccines. And this is why everybody started talking about this, on the issue of vaccinations and whether employers can even require them at all. And so since the pandemic began, as you guys were probably aware of, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the EEOC, has been updating their guidance to handle COVID-19 related issues. And they've allowed a lot more flexibility for employers in terms of medical inquiries to permit, temperature taking, to permit mandated testing regarding COVID. So it's all regarding COVID-19 symptoms. And these are all technically considered medical examinations, at least in the sense that we used to operate under the assumption that those would be considered medical examinations for COVID-19 testing. The EEOC took the view that the pandemic met the direct threat standard under the ADA. And that essentially meant that it was a severe enough of a situation for employers to make these types of health-related inquiries. So that's why you're able to take your employee's temperature. That's why you're able to mandate that they be tested under certain circumstances. Pre-COVID, this would not have happened. It had to otherwise have been a job-related inquiry, or you had to demonstrate a business necessity. So post-COVID, you really could engage in practices that were never possible before. And in addition, they had previously addressed mandatory vaccinations in a very limited context of an influenza vaccination in 2009. And so when they did that, though, it was sort of this loosey-goosey gray area. And they stated, well, you might be entitled to mandate it, but, you know, we want you guys to just encourage it rather than require it. And they never really addressed whether you could, and it was just sort of this gray area. We're not going to give you any real information. So on December 16, they updated their COVID-19 guidance to clarify that vaccinations are not considered medical examinations. And for people who are not in our area of law, or not in, essentially not in our field, this maybe didn't mean a lot. But it's important because for ADA purposes, the fact that they are not considered medical examinations, and I hate air quotes, but I'm doing it now, means that none of the rules of medical examinations apply to vaccines. And a vaccine mandate first doesn't have to be job related, and it doesn't have to be consistent with a business necessity. So those two things are the things that are required for medical examinations. And that means that you can also request a proof of vaccination, and it doesn't have to be job related or consistent with a business necessity. And this is really huge. So this was a big change. This lawyers everywhere our heads were exploding, you know. And so it really changed the landscape of what employers were allowed to do. So and then all of a sudden employers were faced with this question now, okay, so we can theoretically mandate them. Do we want to? And so there's really now two choices, right? Do you want to recommend them or mandate them? So for voluntary vaccinations, you need to remember that there's two components of the voluntary nature of them. It's choosing whether or not to be vaccinated, and then they have to respond to that pre-screening questionnaire. And so if they're dealing with either of the voluntary choices, the important takeaway for you is not to discriminate or retaliate against employees who decline to participate. And you also need to be able to avoid claims of any disparate treatment or hostile work environment claims. So if somebody declines to participate, you need to avoid harassing behavior by other employees. You need to avoid claims of bullying. Those are things that you're going to need to watch out for. And you also need to be very cautious about keeping information about participation or lack thereof in a vaccination program confidential. You don't want them to be harassed. Like if everybody's waiting in line and this one person is still sitting at their desk, everybody's going to be acutely aware of the fact that this one person is not participating, right? So you don't want them to be harassed by other employees for failure to participate, and you really need to minimize those risks on your part.
So now might be, we're getting quite a few questions because we represent a lot of schools, and I just thought that this might be a good time to go into some of those questions that were being asked. And you know, we're going to get into some of the specifics about whether or not you can basically fire somebody for refusing to get vaccinated, but you're right. So with schools, and these we do represent quite a few schools, and two people are asking questions about schools right now. You know, the vaccines are going to be available to teachers very soon, right? In most counties. And Michelle and I were talking through this issue earlier, as an employer, yes, you can actually mandate a vaccine. However, that is with a huge asterisk that if somebody chooses not to get vaccinated, you need to dig deeper. And we're going to get into this actually very, very soon on what that reason is behind it. Because, and I won't jump too far ahead, but if you are thinking about firing somebody for not getting the vaccine, there's an analysis that you have to go through.
Right.
And Michelle, I don't know if you want to add anything at this point to some of the questions about, you know.
Yeah, I can a little bit generally, and we're going to talk about the inquiry right actually on the next slide, I think. So, so this is a good time to talk about it a little bit, but sort of generally, it's a really fact-specific inquiry, and it's almost it's about the employee and what the reason that they are declining the vaccine, but it's also about the employer. So there's a reasonable accommodation inquiry and interactive process that has to be done at that point. So so the question is, maybe you could fire them, maybe, which I know that's like the worst answer that employers are, that attorneys always give. Maybe it depends. But the answer is it depends, because if there is another job that they're qualified for, that could be that, or if they could teach virtually. I mean, there's all these other options with schools, right? At least right now. So you have to go through that process. And what we'll talk about in a little bit is that what the EEOC does not allow you to do is immediately just exclude them from the work environment and terminate them. So that's definitely not what you want to do. You don't want to have them decline the vaccine and then you just fire them. So we'll get to that in just a second, because that's coming up. We're going to get into that just right now, where we're getting into the specific details of it. So that's literally coming up right now, just on the next slide. So, so like we're talking about, the mandatory vaccinations are definitely permissible, but you really have to take care, and this should probably answer your questions. So if you guys have more questions after this, we can chat a little bit more about it. But you really have to take care before you exclude an employee from the workforce who indicates that they cannot receive the vaccine due to a disability. And we'll talk about other reasons for declining a vaccine after this, but this is really, we're going to talk about a medical disability first. So the ADA allows an employer to have a qualification standard that includes that an individual shall not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of individuals in the workplace. However, if a safety-based qualification like a vaccination requirement screens out or tends to screen out an individual with a disability, which is what we're talking about, you have to show that the unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat due to a significant risk, and there's a reason it's in quotes on here, guys, significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that could not be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. This is important. So what this means is that the EEOC requires that you have to do an individualized assessment as to whether the direct threat exists. And it's essentially a 4-step inquiry for you. So, and Cynthia, if you can jump to the next slide. First, you have to make an individualized assessment as to whether this direct threat exists based on the employee not being vaccinated. And you have to look at the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. So for example, and this is an interesting one for schools, if you have been open, if the employees were working on site during the entire pandemic, the direct threat standard is going to be harder to meet. You know, I have a 7-year-old daughter who's in 2nd grade. She is in school now 5 days a week, and we're nervous about it, but it's interesting because this just happened. They just went back 5 days a week. These teachers have been on site and now working with kids during the pandemic, and they have not been vaccinated. I think it would be harder for her school district to meet that direct threat standard unless there's very specific extenuating circumstances. If you have been closed, it might be a little bit easier to meet that direct threat standard, but this is one of those situations where you need to sit down and really analyze this, probably with your attorney, because and talk about whether or not you've met that standard before you start excluding people from the workplace.
Right, and just on that same note, Michelle, somebody's asking about declining the vaccine if they have proof of antibodies. And yes, because there's no direct threat that exists based on that employee not being vaccinated. So
yeah, and that's a medical question that I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer as to whether or not the proof of antibodies means what that means.
But it takes away the direct
I think there's
threat,
just right.
Right?
I mean, in theory, yeah. So I think, yeah, in theory, yes, I think it does. So if you then determine that the individual who cannot be vaccinated poses the direct threat, so let's assume that you determine that they do pose the direct threat, you can't just then, as we mentioned, and if you jump to the next slide, Cindy, you can't just then just fire them, like we're saying. You can't just exclude them from the workplace or really take any action unless there's no way to provide them a reasonable accommodation. And that's absent undue hardship. So it's literally at any time that you have dealt with a disability accommodation, this is the same process you go through with disability accommodation. It's the same thing. So you have to look at that undue hardship standard that you may have dealt with before, which is a pretty high standard. If you want to talk about that with us offline, that's a pretty high standard to meet. There's only a few clients that I've ever had that have met that standard, and they're typically extremely small employers. But unless there's no way to provide a reasonable accommodation that's going to eliminate or reduce this risk so that unvaccinated employee does not pose that direct threat. And, because this is the Wild West of employment law, Cindy and I have been sort of spitballing what that might look like in the context of certain jobs that have been operational this entire time. Would that look like continuing to use COVID protocols going forward for this person? Wearing PPE, wearing, masking and sanitation protocols for this person. We would need to look at that a little bit closer, but you need to figure out if there's absolutely no way to provide a reasonable accommodation for this person. If it's somebody that works in an office, is there a separate office that they could be in where they're not exposing people, or they're not exposed to people as much as they typically are? My mom actually works in a school district. She's an office manager. They have given her a separate office because she has some medical issues that have made COVID exposure a little bigger deal for her. She's in a separate office now. So there's accommodations that you can give employees under these circumstances where it can help you, but it's something that you really need to slow down and think through with each employee, because it's not going to be a one size fits all circumstance. It's going to be fact intensive for each employee. So if you get to the point where you've determined that there's no reasonable accommodation that exists for this employee, which would eliminate or reduce the risk, you have to determine if there's any other leave rights policies that apply. If you're dealing with a teacher, I would definitely refer back to the collective bargaining agreement, because you're going to be dealing with union issues also, or anybody that's covered by a part of a union or covered by a collective bargaining agreement. But you also want to look to see if remote work is possible, if they could potentially be covered by FFCRA leave, if that gets extended any further past March, if they have the potential for FMLA or CFRA leave, or if there's the potential for a short-term, leave, just an unpaid leave of absence until the pandemic has neutralized. And that those are all potentially reasonable accommodations. And I will tell you that unpaid leaves of absences typically have been considered by courts to be a reasonable accommodation under specific medical circumstances. So if it is a short-term leave of absence that you can tolerate for a short period of time, that may be something to consider. So those are the concerns that you're going to need to watch out for. So if there is, if the employee cannot be vaccinated for COVID-19 because of that disability, no reasonable accommodation protocol, it would be lawful for them though, or lawful for the employer then to exclude the employee from the workplace. But again, does not mean automatically terminate. If there's no other leaves that apply, there's no possibility for unpaid leave of absence, which in the context of a school district, I think that's probably something you should consider because you are a larger employer. But the EEOC really specifically cautions against automatic termination. So you really need to consult with your legal counsel to determine if any of these other rights apply. And as you can tell by us, or by me constantly recommending that you talk to your legal counsel, it's really a minefield. And you should be either calling us if you're one of our clients or contacting your legal counsel before you make any missteps on this, because it's really an area where clients make a lot of mistakes if they try and approach this on their own, and we're happy to provide guidance on this.
So Michelle, just to pause here for a second, because we have an interesting question on the chat that I'll read out to everybody. You know, this person is saying that they're an essential employer. In an abundance of caution, they permitted everyone to work from home temporarily. It's now been a year. Sounds like a lot of us. We are starting to consider returning to work. One employee does not want to return to work because, one, he had to move a considerable distance away from work, and two, his partner interacts considerably with her grandmother and they're afraid of COVID. Part of his job requires him to work on the premises. We have accommodated his request to not go into the office temporarily. Now he is saying he wants this permanently. His job has administrative duties that require working on the premises. When we bring everyone back, can we insist on his coming back to the premises?
This is like a
lot. We're getting long questions
pattern
today.
So there's a couple of questions I would have, but I can tell you one thing. So this isn't his medical issue. So if it's not his medical issue, that means something. The one thing I would check on, because you did say it's his partner, if it is a domestic partner, and there's a care issue with the grandmother, I would double check to make sure that CFRA leave does not apply, and that there's no leave, potential leave issues if there's a potential for CFRA leave, because that does cover grandparents now. If that is not applicable to this situation and it's not his medical issue, he does not get a reasonable accommodation for somebody else's medical issue. And we've had a lot of this with clients where they wanted accommodations for somebody else's medical issue. And as unfortunate as it is, you don't get an accommodation for somebody else's medical issue unless it falls under FFCRA leave or CFRA leave. So unless it falls under one of those leaves statutes, you're going to be able to insist that he comes back. But if you have questions, Dana, maybe we can talk to you offline a little bit in more detail about this one, because this sounds like it's a little bit of a unique situation.
Especially since you've accommodated him to work from home or, you know, out of the office temporarily, it becomes a much bigger issue there.
Right.
And then, Michelle, I'm seeing a hand raised by Carla. Carla, I'm going to allow you to talk right now if you want to unmute yourself. I don't know if that was a purposeful hand raise, but feel free to ask your question.
Oh, I think that was from way earlier.
Oh, was it? Oh,
yeah, that was up early.
Okay. Carla, anything to add?
Nope.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sorry, Carla. Okay. So moving on really quickly, just for one more accommodation is a religious accommodation. And that's at one point that we have really been hearing a lot of rumblings that we think that for the COVID vaccine that there's going to be a lot of, just because of some nuances of how the vaccine has been developed and tested. So if an employee indicates that they're unable to receive a vaccine because of a sincerely held religious belief or practice, you really have to take the same level of care before excluding them from the workforce. It's a bit different than a disability, but you have to take the request just as seriously. The one thing that we have been, anti-vax is not a religion. We'll get into the anti-vaxxers, but anti-vax is not a religion. So we'll just say that that does not apply here. If somebody just says, I don't believe in vaccinations and that's my religion, that does not apply. But the EEOC has explained that the definition of religion is really broad and it protects religious beliefs, practices, and observances, which you might even be unfamiliar with. So you really need to assume that if they claim that it's based on a sincerely held religious belief, that it is based on a sincerely held religious belief. If you have some objective basis for questioning it, then you're justified in asking for additional supporting information, but you need to be aware that additional supporting information can be also really broad. It can be based on their own testimony of what they what they believe. It doesn't have to be like attendance records from church or temple. It can be, you know, these are my beliefs and this is what I believe. That can be enough. And so as a practical matter, you know, although it is a lower burden to establish undue hardship for an employer when you're dealing with a religious accommodation, you really need to use the same approach to the reasonable accommodation through the interactive process that we just talked about. So, and this is really because the EEOC in their infinite wisdom used the identical language that they used for the ADA like physical disability, medical disabilities that they did for this one. So in stating that if there's no reasonable accommodation possible, it would be lawful to exclude them from the workplace, that they qualify it exactly the same way, that it doesn't mean that you should automatically terminate the worker and that you need to determine that if other rights apply. So we really recommend approaching any religious request for accommodation the same as you would with ADA issues. So next, Cindy is going to talk about some third-party and offsite workforce issues.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. So the biggest questions we've received from our clients regarding vaccines and are related to employees who go off-site to customers and clients. They are concerned that eventually customers and clients will require employees to provide proof of vaccination while on site, causing headaches for the employer and implicating, you know, the ADA and religious accommodation issues we just discussed. So just remember that asking about a COVID-19 vaccination is not a medical examination in and of itself, which is good news. You can ask. But there are potential laws that control or constrain the disclosure of that information, and there may be issues with the confidentiality of the answer. So the biggest problem will be with the follow-up question if the answer is no, because it's bound to be, you know, well, why not, right? So this may start to get into a medical examination and further than the inquiry is permitted to go by the current EEOC guidance. So certainly the implications of requesting or not requesting this proof are that if the proof is not requested, it might undermine the customer or client's own workforce mandate if on-site personnel are not mandated. And it can jeopardize your basis for excluding other people from the workforce. However, right now, it's hard enough for one workforce to get access to the vaccine, let alone two entire workforces. So this is more of a consideration for further down the road. And then I wanted to get into some wage and hour issues that we see. The biggest question related to wage and hour is whether employers are required to pay an employee for the time they spend to get vaccinated. And of course, the answer is it depends, maybe, and it really depends on how you approach the vaccine in the workplace, because we now have clients sending out, like having nurses or whoever can administer the vaccine come into the workforce and do, you know, a lot of vaccines at that point. So if the employer recommends but does not require vaccinations, it's unlikely to be compensable unless the vaccination occurs on the employer's premises during regular working time. And if that's the case, it should be paid. But consider that if an employer does not compensate the employee for the time spent, even if the vaccine is only recommended, the employee is probably much more likely to seek out and receive the vaccination. So in addition, if the employer makes a vaccine mandatory, it is almost certainly going to be considered time worked because it is the time the employee was under the employer's control. And as we mentioned, however, because this is a new issue that has not been considered by the courts, it probably makes sense to pay the employee for their time, even if it's not required, to just encourage compliance by your employees. Additionally, Michelle and I have talked about some incentive programs as another way for employers to encourage vaccinations without mandating them. And let me just check the chat right now. Okay, you say we're going to get there. Perfect. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, I got it.
So employers regularly provide cash awards to incentivize employees to engage in certain behaviors. So typically a wellness plan is a generally established, and these can be a little complicated, as some of you may know. If a premium reduction is granted, HIPAA governs the programs. However, most of these would not be done through the health plan because most employers want all employees vaccinated, not just those in this particular health plan. Now, EEOC regulations govern programs which would require a medical examination or disability-related inquiry. However, because it's unlikely that vaccine incentive programs would fall within this category, the good news is that programs regarding COVID-19 vaccinations are likely not subject to EEOC regulations. This would permit larger incentives for employees than are typically permitted under EEOC regulations. But then you have ADA rules protecting disabled employees, which are still applicable. So basically, what does this mean? Some alternative must be provided for people who are unable to take the vaccine so that all employees can participate. Additionally, when publicizing some sort of incentive program to your employees, it is likely a best practice to ask employees to notify the employer if they cannot be vaccinated, which is fine, so that the appropriate accommodation can then be determined. And, you know, again, there's no clear guidance on this right now, and it's a bit of a minefield, but certainly not a risk-free area given the so many unknowns at this time. And then also just be mindful, of course, of wage and hour issues, because Michelle and I deal a lot with this issue. The issue of bonuses given under these types of programs, payments and value of these types of benefits are typically considered discretionary bonuses and are not included in the employee's rate of pay for overtime calculation purposes. However, every plan is set up differently, and it is possible that an employer could inadvertently make a misstep on the wage and hour side. So just make sure you're talking to someone about setting up this incentive program before you do so. And then just some impacts on the anti-vax movement. So mandatory workplace vaccination programs not only implicate potential medical and religious objections, of course, but they may also implicate free speech considerations in the workplace. And both union and non-union employers may have employees who are concerned with the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines, particularly given its, emergency use authorization status. And even absent a union or collective bargaining agreement, a group of co-workers protesting a mandatory vaccination requirement could be viewed as a protective activity. Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act provides that employees may engage in concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. And then the National Labor Relations Act may view employee speech related to vaccination mandates as having a direct nexus to employees' interests, as vaccination may be considered a term or condition of employment. So this basically means that the employers generally cannot prohibit conversations or conduct related to working conditions, even if they are couched into current events and even if inflammatory or political in nature. So discussions or protests of mandatory vaccination programs are likely to be protected under free speech. Additionally, of course, in California, employers cannot take action or retaliate against employees because they have engaged in some sort of lawful political activity outside of the workplace. And this means that employees protesting workplace mandatory vaccination programs when off work could be protected from retaliation or any type of adverse employment actions. And then OSHA has not issued an order on this issue yet. However, we think there's a strong likelihood of the new federal OSHA COVID-19 standards that may include the requirement that a provision of a COVID-19 vaccine is required in order to provide a safe work environment. So that's to be determined. And then just some privacy issues, and then I see the question in the chat, so we'll get to that in just a second. But Even though the EEOC does not consider a vaccine a medical examination, be mindful of issues related to the privacy of medical information. So California's Confidentiality of Medical Information Act requires employers to protect the privacy and security of any medical information that they receive. This would include information collected and disclosed in relation to an employer vaccination program. So something to be mindful. One of the questions we're getting in the chat, which I know, Michelle, it sounds like we need to look into a little bit further, is can your landlord require proof that you and your employees have been vaccinated? I'm assuming not your residential landlord, but your commercial landlord. And can you be evicted because of non-compliance to their request, or can you be evicted because some may not be vaccinated? Yeah, commercial landlord, yes. So that's an interesting question, because ultimately, you know, if your landlord, I honestly, I know Michelle will look into this just to confirm, because we don't, you know, this issue has not come up yet, but my gut reaction here is that no, your landlord cannot require this proof.
My gut is no too, but I'll double check it.
Yeah, that's just too far reaching. You know, it might be different if you were renting space from your landlord who is on the premises every single day. But I don't even know if there's that type of relationship in a landlord-tenant commercial relationship. My gut is no, but Michelle can email you. You have a slumlord. I'm sorry to hear that. Oh man. Okay. Michelle, you want to get into some employee relations?
Sure. So we've been talking for a lot of the presentation about, you know, what employers are permitted to do. So what you can do. Can you mandate that employees receive a COVID-19 vaccine? The answer is yes, you can. But we haven't really addressed the equally important question of, should you mandate that employees receive the vaccine? And this really implicates the intangible employee morale and employee relations issues that are really worth mentioning as a consideration to decide how you want to proceed with a vaccination protocol in your business. And something interesting that Cindy and I found when we were researching this was that we found a survey that was done in Europe that stated that they essentially asked the same question to the groups of employees in different countries. And employees were much less likely to want to get the vaccine if the employer mandated it. And it was a stark contrast of whether or not they wanted to do it. And it was almost literally like, if your mom says you have to do something, you don't want to do it. And it's that if somebody in a position of power tells you you have to, your gut is that you just don't want to do it. And so it really is us in terms of what we're going to recommend to clients moving forward, because if there's ways to give incentives and consider that information, you may be able to make a better choice for your business moving forward. So if you think about the employee perspective, you know, you have employees who are concerned about the same thing that all of us are concerned about. We've all had so many life stressors related to the pandemic, COVID fatigue, we've all had that. You know, financial insecurity, you know, lasting health implications of the virus or the vaccine. You know, some people are very concerned about the vaccine, you know, justified or not. Changed family or living circumstances. You know, one of you in the chat was talking about that, somebody who moved during the pandemic. You know, political polarization, which has calmed down a little bit, but was pretty bad there for a while. You know, misinformation about the virus and the vaccine. You know, all of these are things to keep in mind. They're not just things that we are dealing with. They're things that employees are bringing to work every day, and they should really be on your mind when you're considering implementing a vaccine program. And I'm glad to hear that at least one of you was considering an incentive program, because I really think that that's probably the way to go. You know, the other thing to consider is that different categories of workers are going to be eligible at different times, depending on the location, the age, their nature of work, their specific job responsibilities. Especially for larger employers, the job responsibilities, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. pre-existing health conditions. For example, there's going to be positions where, an employer has less control over safety, and those positions are going to be prioritized. But if there's positions in different locations where there's less exposure to the public, they're not going to be prioritized. And there's also going to be demographic differences. So that are going to influence the willingness to get vaccines, including race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, and then pregnancy and family planning concerns. And whether those are justified concerns or not, you really have to factor those in. As you're considering, whether to implement a recommended or mandatory vaccine program in the future, some items we really want you to consider in order to engage with your employees and make the program really as successful as possible is to remember that the vaccines are still in the emergency use authorization status, and they're authorized, but they are really still experimental. And under the terms of the authorization, everyone who gets the vaccine gets to decide at the time of taking the vaccine whether or not they want to receive it. So if you have a mandatory vaccine requirement and then you're trying to align that with the employee having the choice at the time of the vaccine, that's really difficult to align those two things, because they're going to be in the position of their employer saying they have to do something, but then have a waiver under their nose that says this is optional, you don't have to do this. That's a difficult thing to sell to your employees. And some of our clients have been concerned about what would happen if a lot of their employees just opted out at the time of the vaccine and just left. With staffing shortages in some industries, it's not making a lot of the clients that I've spoken to inclined to mandate the vaccine at this point when they have talked through that concern. And so another recommendation that we have is really focus on fact-based messaging. We assume that the new administration will focus on fact-based messaging through a public health campaign. And you should really mirror that in your own messaging to your employees. You should assume that there's going to be hesitation from the employees, so focusing on facts is really helpful to counteract that. And also just consider obstacles in advance. If you have logistical challenges that you need to be working on once the vaccine becomes available, start working with them now, whether that's translating documents, figuring out staffing arrangements. All of these things take time to organize and get into place. I have a friend who is unfortunately going through chemo right now, but in the medical facility where she's getting chemo treatment, they vaccinated an entire floor of nurses all on the same day. And all of them started experiencing slight symptoms all at the same day. And it took out like half of the staff on that floor all on the same day. That created a staffing problem. So consider that before you vaccinate your entire staff all on the same day. Maybe phase it in. Those are just things to figure out before you're just making those decisions. And then Cynthia can pick that up. Sorry.
Yeah, just go over some key takeaways. And actually, Michelle, speaking of people, getting vaccinated who are working in hospitals, I just had surgery last month or a couple weeks ago, and my surgeon said most of his team in the emergency room is not getting vaccinated. And so he's like, I might call you for some vaccine, employment support. I thought that was interesting. He said about 30% of his team is not getting vaccinated right now. So, and they're in the health field. By the way, I was in the emergency room, but all good and I'm safe now. So for now, and until the vaccine is more widely available, we recommend that employers just take action to prepare for future vaccination programs by engaging and supporting the public health effort, assessing how your workforce will fit into the phased vaccine plans, determining that costs associated with the vaccines, if any, considering accounting for vaccination time as hours worked and paying your employees for such, continuing existence of COVID-19 protocols that are in place, and prepare for additional guidance. Just develop that positive, accurate, and fact-based messaging. And I see, Michelle, you took care of that last question. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And then really, no matter who you use as your employment attorney, make sure you're doing at least 2 check-ins with them a year so much has changed in the last year, especially on employment law. And I really thought last year was going to be all about AB 5 and the exemptions, and then COVID came and took us all for a loop. So just make sure, you're constantly checking in with them, because new laws are changing quite often. We did an employment law seminar, I think it was just last week, on the new laws of 2021. So if anyone wants our cheat sheet, it's just a one-page form of the new things. And the biggest thing is CFRA leave, which affects employers of 5 or more. Make sure whoever you're using has an experienced team of attorneys, and that you do a liability assessment early on if you know, or if you have a red flag about any of your employees who may turn around and file a lawsuit against you. Here's our contact information, although I'm assuming you guys all have it. Email, phone, office. We're always happy to keep in touch, and we're always happy to answer any questions. I hope we were able to answer everyone's questions throughout. Thank you guys, and we'd really like to end on time. It is 11 a.m. on the dot. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, and have a great weekend.